We're ready to start. All right, thank you everybody for coming to this afternoon's press conference. I'm Judy Keene, Director of Public Affairs for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I would like to introduce Bishop Christopher Coyne of Burlington, Vermont, who is also the chair of our Committee on Communications, and he will introduce our press panelists today. And then, as we've done in the previous press conferences, at that point, you can then raise your hand, I'll choose you, you can approach the mic and ask your question. Thank you. Bishop Coyne.
Thank you, Judy. Starting down at the far end is Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of the Archdiocese of Louisville. He is here representing the Committee for Religious Liberty. In the middle is Bishop Robert McManus of the Diocese of Worcester, Massachusetts, not pronounced as it's spelled. He is the chairman of the subcommittee on healthcare. And finally, to my direct left is Bishop Timothy Doherty, who is chair of the Committee for the Protection of Children and Young People.
Great. Okay, do we have any a first question for a bishop panelist? Yes, Michael.
First question is Bishop Doherty on the revisions to the, there were no major revisions to the Charter for the Protection of Children. So I was wondering if you could have a comment or a response to critics who say that the Charter doesn't provide adequate defense mechanisms for priests, especially falsely accused, in light of the recent presentation on criminal convictions and so forth. Your response to that?
The center of your question is about priests who are falsely accused?
The Charter protections for removal of priests as soon as they're accused and things like that, those type of interventions that don't provide for criminal defense or reputation, ongoing reputation restoration.
As best as I could tell you, there are provisions in canon law to protect the reputations of people and to protect a process whereby things are done very carefully. And that really is about all I can say. A credible, you wouldn't remove or discipline a man until you had a credible allegation. And that's a church process. If an allegation comes from outside the church and, for instance, is instituted by a prosecutor or some legal system or a child protective agency, then you'd be in the throes of that process, and the civil government would be in control of that. But the church's job at that point would be, if indeed a person has been falsely accused, the church would have a role in rehabilitating that man's reputation or his name.
Okay, Dennis.
I am wondering about the Dennis Sadowski, Catholic News Service. I'm wondering about the process. You've changed Bishop Doherty from 2 years to 7 years, and I talked to Deacon Bernie about that. But I would like to hear from you a little bit about why that was extended, because I know you had some questions during the process from what Bernie told me. Mm-hmm. So tell me about that, about why that was extended for that period of time.
I'm on the committee for about 1.5 years now, and I'm chairman since last November. But I think part of the extended concern is this go-around took longer than people might think. The other reason is, I think we've stated publicly, that we want to give ourselves time to take in the pertinent research with regard to how to treat children and the effects of trauma on children, and whether we're fully accounting for the behavior both of perpetrators and the children. And there's some open questions about whether some of the child protective education that we've done is actually itself causing some issues among children and families, and whether we're aiming our education at the proper level, whether it's at the school in general or just at parents. And so more of this will come in. Part of the National Review Board also has a research arm to it. There's a committee on the research, and we want to take advantage of what's best going forward, and that's going to take a while to absorb.
Okay. Brian Rowe.
Brian Rowe, National Catholic Reporter. A frequent criticism of the Charter has always been that it did not apply to bishops. During this revision process, was there consideration given to applying the charter to bishops, to putting them under the zero tolerance policy, particularly with respect for alleged covering up of abuse? And also, was there consideration given to parish audits, which is something that the National Review Board has recommended for a couple of years now?
Two questions about bishops. And what was that second part again? I'd stay there till I answer both parts. Yeah, the charter is aimed at clergy. The bishops are under the jurisdiction of the Holy See. And so we don't have the legal standing in church law to cover the bishops. It's apparent from the news over the last 6 months at least that the Vatican is taking disciplinary actions against bishops who haven't been diligent or themselves cooperated somehow in abuse. So that is a developing piece of church practice and jurisprudence. So it simply wasn't designed. You know, it's like criticizing a Navy ship for saying, well, it's not an airplane. You know, what are you doing about that part of the world? So it's a very specific device aimed at clergy. And the second part of your question.
Were parish audits considered? That was something that the review board and the auditors have discussed in recent years.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question. As you may know, the National Review Board has been promoting parish audits for quite some time. And in our discussions this week, we had several meetings before things were presented to the full body of bishops, both from the auditor's point of view and from the review board's point of view, that parish audits are wonderful, effective, necessary, and will help us with our accountability and also help us to encourage people on the local level. Some of those audits may be done by the outside auditor coming in. A number of dioceses are doing parish audits on their own and then reporting those results, in this case to Stonebridge. So I would say there's a momentum with regard to these parish audits as just part to aid compliance, not to beat anybody up or think that one parish is worse than another, but just to keep us on our toes.
Okay, great. And maybe just a few more questions in the interest of time for lunch for the bishops as well, too. Michael, go ahead.
Michael Drake from American TFP. Paul, I forgot to identify myself before. This one's on the ERD directives. And could you, Bishop McManus, could you help us understand the discussion that went on over these agreements between hospitals and different dioceses? Could you give us some examples of agreements that were blocked or were changed because of the bishop's concerns?
Well, actually, what precipitated the revision of Part 6 of the ERDs was a specific case. There was a Catholic health system in the West that had taken into its governance non-Catholic hospitals. And these non-Catholic hospitals were performing immoral activities, direct sterilization and provision of contraception, not abortion, but nonetheless, because they were under the jurisdiction of a Catholic hospital system, that there was a problem, more problem. That type of situation precipitated, and then that particular Catholic organization, when it realized there was a moral difficulty, they morphed from being a Catholic institution to a non-Catholic institution. That change of identity with the Catholic Church raised some eyebrows. And so that came to the attention of the Doctrine Committee. We gave that example that we call a dubium. A question was sent to Rome saying, was this done properly? Ethical justification. And usually the answer comes back yes or no. What came back was a list of 17 principles that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith asked the American bishops to look at in terms of providing a context or framework within which to evaluate morally whether these growing number of collaborations between non-Catholic hospitals, Catholic hospitals, and non-Catholic hospitals, when they're done according to the moral teaching of the Church. So that's what precipitated the revision of the ERDs, Part 6.
Okay, yes. Final question.
Jim Davis for the Catholic Miami edition. I'm I'm curious about the religious freedom emphasis and whether there's an overlap with others. Two-part question, I guess. What are the remaining freedom issues that you're concerned about? Lately, you had the Supreme Court case that came out in favor of the person who didn't want to decorate a cake for gays. And there's also the question, of course, of whether doctors would perform abortion at non-Catholic hospitals. So there is an overlap, I believe, between the ERD and religious freedom and freedom of conscience. So how about it?
Well, Archbishop Kurtz.
Would you want me to say something about Religious Freedom Week, first of all?
Yes.
That might be a helpful thing.
Yeah, okay.
I'm giving the presentation.
Okay. Also, what remaining religious freedom issues do you see?
Sure.
I'm sure it has a lot to do with freedom of conscience and things like that, too.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Let me begin by saying that Religious Freedom Week, which begins actually next Friday, I'm going to give this in public session actually after lunch, so we're a little bit ahead of the game, I know that. But it's looking at a couple of things. First of all, we're looking at the need for our bishops to understand the important role that we have in helping to shape a culture, to inspire a culture. And in doing so, it's not just responding to a negative, but it's positively looking without in any way imposing on how we propose a vision. And so I'll talk about that after lunch in public session. But the second thing, rightly you mentioned, is this notion of how do we make space for really legitimate voices of faith, both in witnessing but also in providing a service in a way that they don't have to give up the integrity of their faith. So a couple of examples that I think would be on the front burner. One, of course, would be how do agencies, faith-based agencies that provide adoption and foster care, how are they able to provide that care? And so our emphasis is very much in looking at the child first. We have 400,000 young people who are in need of foster care. And with the opioid crisis that's been very well documented, sadly, that's increasing. So we're saying this is not the time to be reducing the number of agencies that are providing this care. That's one of the issues that I would highlight. You may have been following that in Kansas and in Oklahoma, there were just laws that would support faith-based groups to be able to do so without governmental interference. We're going to have, believe it or not, 8 videos, and the 8 videos, each of which will have a bishop giving something between a 2 and a 3 minute message. And in those videos, they will go everything from health care. We can talk about the Conscience Protection Act, that is still active. We're still working on the ability of a healthcare worker to be able to work within her or his institution without being forced to do objectionable or participate in objectionable procedures. This particular one is on abortion. So there's in the area of migration services, there's the necessity of us being vigilant on issues that could arise. We have in the area of education, in the area of pro-life services, migration services. I probably forgot one, but there's about 6 different areas that we'll have videos on. So in each one of those areas, we're either in the area of being vigilant to make sure we make space for people. And remember, the very famous one about the work of the Little Sisters of the Poor is not finished yet. We've had some helpful steps that have been taken, but there still are injunctions that have to be addressed. So we'd like to look at it from two viewpoints. One would be, how do we take the high road and make sure that we're inspiring culture, that we're trying to inspire our culture to really care for one another, to look at the dignity of the human person, to look at our vision of sexuality, all of which are efforts for us not to impose a vision on others, but to be part of that public debate and discussion going on. And then, of course, what we just mentioned, the notion of not being in a position where we're actually restricting the space for people of faith to not only witness, but also to serve other people with integrity of faith. That's a little bit of a background.
Bishop McManus is going to respond. Okay. Great. All right. Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming to each of the press conferences, and we appreciate your coverage of the 2018 General Assembly Spring Edition. And thank you also, Your Excellencies, as well. Thank you.